Claire Harrison. That's the name my husband screamed into the phone 18 minutes after he told me to get out. By then, every joint account we shared had already been frozen. By then, my signature had already triggered the withdrawal of my $885 million ownership stake from the company everyone believed belonged to him. By then, the empire he thought he controlled had started collapsing one legal document at a time. My phone kept vibrating on the passenger seat. One missed call, then 12, then 34, then 67. I didn't answer a single one. Because less than half an hour earlier, while everyone around us sang happy birthday to our little boy, I'd watched my husband kiss my best friend. And when I confronted him, he looked me straight in the eyes and said 5 words I'll never forget. Accept it or get out. So I did. I got out. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I carried the only thing that truly mattered. My son. People often assume that betrayal arrives with warning signs loud enough for anyone to hear. Looking back now, I know that's rarely true. It comes quietly wrapped inside routines, excuses, and little changes you explain away, because love makes you generous with second chances. My name is Claire Harrison. I'm 38 years old, a widow's daughter, the mother of one beautiful little boy named Ethan, and for most of my adult life, the woman standing just outside the spotlight, while everyone applauded someone else. Our home sat on nearly 4 acres in Fairfield County, Connecticut. It wasn't flashy by billionaire standards, though magazines occasionally featured it, because the gardens overlooked a small private lake. My father had bought the property decades earlier when Harrison Capital was still a modest investment firm with fewer than 20 employees. Dad believed success should be lived quietly. He drove his own car. He knew every employee's spouse by name. Every Christmas, he personally handed bonuses to the custodial staff before anyone else. When he passed away 6 years earlier after a brief illness, I inherited his shares according to a trust that had been carefully planned long before anyone imagined he would be gone so soon. Those shares represented 62% of Harrison Capital. Most people never knew. That was exactly how Dad wanted it. Daniel and I met 15 years ago at a charity fundraiser in New York. He was handsome without trying too hard, confident without seeming arrogant. At least that's how he appeared then. He made me laugh. He remembered small details. When we married, people called us the perfect couple. For a long time, they were probably right. Then success grew faster than character. Harrison Capital expanded into private equity, commercial real estate, and technology investments. Newspapers loved interviewing Daniel because he spoke well on camera. I preferred conference rooms over television studios, spreadsheets over microphones. Eventually, the public began referring to Harrison Capital as Daniel Harrison's company. Neither of us corrected them. It didn't seem important, until it became everything. Our son Ethan arrived after years of believing we might never have children. Holding him for the first time felt like every disappointment I'd ever carried suddenly made sense. He was the greatest gift of my life. His first birthday deserved to be special. Melissa insisted on helping organize everything. Melissa Carter had been my best friend since college. We survived finals together, stood beside each other at our weddings, visited each other through illnesses, promotions, heartbreaks, and celebrations. She knew every chapter of my life, or so I believed. The party filled our backyard with nearly 80 guests, neighbors, family, business associates, children chasing balloons, grandparents sitting beneath white tents. The smell of barbecue drifted through the summer air. While a local jazz trio played soft standards everyone over 60 seemed to recognize immediately. My mother-in-law spent nearly an hour showing Ethan to anyone willing to admire him. "He has Daniel's smile," she proudly announced. I smiled politely. Actually, he had my father's eyes. The same gentle gray. The same thoughtful expression. Small details matter to mothers. Daniel floated naturally from group to group, shaking hands, laughing loudly, accepting compliments as though he were hosting a corporate reception instead of his son's birthday. I watched him from across the yard. He barely looked at me. Months earlier, that might have hurt. Now it simply felt familiar. Marriage changes. People become busy. Children demand attention. Those were the explanations I repeated to myself whenever something felt slightly off. Melissa appeared carrying another tray of lemonade. "You've hardly eaten," she said warmly. "I've been chasing a 1-year-old. She laughed. "You always wanted this." I did. She squeezed my shoulder. "I'm happy for you." Funny how some lies sound exactly like kindness. As afternoon turned toward evening, guests gathered around the birthday cake. Blue frosting. Tiny edible stars. One oversized candle shaped like the number 1. Someone dimmed the patio lights. Everyone crowded close. Phones came out. Grandparents leaned forward. The familiar chorus began. "Happy birthday to you." Ethan clapped because everyone else was clapping. He had no idea the song was for him. He simply laughed. I'll remember that laugh until the day I die. Halfway through the song, I noticed Daniel wasn't beside us anymore. At first, I assumed he'd stepped inside to answer a business call. That happened often. Then I realized Melissa had disappeared too. Something inside me tightened. Not panic. Not suspicion. Just awareness. A tiny thread pulling at the edge of my thoughts. I quietly slipped away before anyone noticed. The hallway inside the house was cool and silent after the cheerful noise outside. The kitchen was empty. So was the living room. I walked past the staircase toward my father's old study. The door wasn't completely closed. Just slightly open. Enough to hear a whisper, then a laugh. Melissa's laugh. I stopped. Every instinct told me to turn around. Instead, I looked through the narrow opening. Daniel had both hands around her waist. She touched his face like she'd done it hundreds of times. Then they kissed. Not briefly, not awkwardly, comfortably. Like two people who had stopped worrying about getting caught. Time slowed in the strangest way. I noticed ridiculous things. The antique clock Dad had restored himself, the framed fishing photo on the bookshelf, Melissa's lipstick on Daniel's collar. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply closed the door as quietly as I'd opened it. Outside applause erupted. Ethan had blown out his candle with everyone's help. I walked back into the backyard wearing the same smile I'd worn all afternoon. Nobody noticed anything. I held my son. Posed for photographs. Opened presents. Thanked guests for coming. An elderly neighbor hugged me. "You've built such a beautiful family, Claire." I hugged her back. "Thank you." Sometimes grace means surviving the next 5 minutes. The last guests finally left shortly after 9. Paper plates littered the tables. Half-deflated balloons drifted across the lawn. The catering staff packed their equipment. Melissa had already gone home, or so Daniel claimed. He poured himself a drink as if nothing unusual had happened. I stood in the kitchen watching him. "We need to talk." He sighed before I finished speaking. "Can this wait?" "No." He looked annoyed more than concerned. "What now?" "I saw you." His expression didn't change. Not even a flicker. In Dad's study. Still nothing. "You and Melissa." He set his glass down. Without saying a word, he grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to leave bruises, but firmly enough that I had no choice except to follow him upstairs. He pulled me into our bedroom, closed the door, locked it, then turned toward me with a face so cold I barely recognized the man I'd married. "Claire," he said evenly, "accept it or get out." I stared at him, waiting for the apology that never came. Instead, he continued. "Melissa understands me. She doesn't question every decision I make. This has been going on for a while, and honestly, I'm tired of pretending. You brought her into our son's birthday." He shrugged. "It wasn't planned." "You kissed her in my father's study." Another shrug. I deserve to be happy. I searched his face for guilt. There wasn't any. Only certainty. Then he delivered the sentence that convinced me my marriage had already ended long before tonight. "You won't leave anyway. You need this life too much." He believed the house was his. The company was his. The money was his. And I was simply the woman who benefited from it. I looked at him for another long moment. Then I walked past him without saying another word. He didn't stop me. Upstairs, Ethan was asleep in his crib, still wearing the little blue sweater my mother had knitted for him. I lifted him carefully into my arms. He stirred, rested his tiny head against my shoulder, and fell back asleep. I carried one small overnight bag. Nothing else. No jewelry. No photographs. No arguments. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the house where I'd believed my family would grow old together. In less than 30 minutes, Daniel Harrison would discover just how little he understood about the woman he had ordered to leave. I didn't look back as the gates closed behind me. The road leading away from our home wound through quiet neighborhoods where porch lights glowed softly against the warm Connecticut night. Ethan slept peacefully in his car seat, completely unaware that his entire world had changed before he had even finished celebrating his first birthday. I envied him. Children don't measure life by betrayal. They measure it by whether someone is there when they wake up. I whispered into the rearview mirror. "I'm here, sweetheart." He never opened his eyes. I drove without a destination for nearly 20 minutes before pulling into the parking lot of a small waterfront hotel in Stamford. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, discreet, and close enough to Manhattan for the business calls I already knew I needed to make. The young woman at the front desk smiled kindly. Checking in. Just for a few nights. She noticed Ethan sleeping in my arms. He looks exhausted. It was a big birthday. She handed me a room key. I hope tomorrow is easier. So do I. Neither of us knew how impossible that wish was. Once inside the room, I laid Ethan carefully in the portable crib the hotel staff brought upstairs. I watched him breathe for several long minutes. Then I walked onto the small balcony overlooking the harbor. The cool night air steadied me. I finally allowed myself one deep breath. Not a sob. Not anger. Just acceptance. My father used to tell me something whenever difficult decisions landed on his desk. Claire, emotions belong in your heart. Decisions belong in your head. I had spent years believing those words were about business. That night I realized they were about survival. I reached into my handbag and removed the leather folder I almost always carried. Most women carried cosmetics. I carried legal documents. Years earlier, after my father died, our attorneys insisted I never travel without copies of the trust agreements and emergency corporate authorizations. They hoped I'd never need them. Neither did I. I dialed the first number. Richard, my attorney answered on the second ring. Claire. His voice immediately changed. What's happened? I've left Daniel. Silence. Then a slow exhale. I was afraid this day might come. You knew. I knew something wasn't right. I didn't know what. I need the emergency provisions. He didn't ask questions. When? Now. I'll notify the legal team. Everything. Understood. He paused. Are you safe? Yes. And Ethan? Sleeping. Good. I'll handle the rest. I ended the call. Next came Margaret Ellis, my private banker in New York. She had worked with my father for almost 30 years. When she heard my voice, she immediately sensed something unusual. You never call this late. I need immediate action. I'm listening. I want every joint personal account frozen tonight. No exceptions. No exceptions. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. This will create quite a reaction. I know. Do you have legal authority? I signed it 6 years ago. I remember. So do it. It'll be done within minutes. Her calm professionalism reminded me why Dad trusted her completely. The third call mattered most. It wasn't to the CEO. It wasn't to the board. It was to Harrison Capital's corporate secretary. Few people outside executive leadership understood the role. She maintained every official corporate record, every shareholder authorization, every emergency governance document. Her name was Linda. She answered sleepily. Claire, I'm sorry to wake you. You never need to apologize. I need Resolution 12 activated. Complete silence. When she finally spoke, her voice had become formal. Are you certain? Yes. That provision has never been used. I know. It will immediately trigger board notification. I understand. It may affect the market. I understand. It could remove nearly $900 million in equity. I understand. Another pause. Then one simple sentence. I'll begin immediately. The call ended. I leaned against the balcony railing. There it was, the point of no return. People often imagine enormous financial decisions happen with dramatic speeches and crowded conference rooms. Most don't. Sometimes they happen because one exhausted woman says one quiet word. Yes. My father had insisted on unusual protections after several friends lost family businesses through bitter divorces and hostile takeovers. He structured Harrison Capital so that inherited controlling shares could never be manipulated by marriage alone. Ownership remained mine. Always. Even Daniel had signed acknowledgments years earlier. I often wondered whether he had actually read them. Apparently not. The fourth call surprised even me. I phoned our chief financial officer, David Moreno. He answered cautiously. Claire, you'll be hearing from Linda. I already received 2 alerts. They're real. What happened? Daniel. He didn't ask for details. Instead, he quietly asked, What do you need from me? I need payroll protected. He sounded confused. Payroll. Whatever happens over the next few weeks, our employees don't deserve uncertainty. We have over 1,200 people. I know every one of them depends on those paychecks. You've already thought this through. No. I looked through the glass door at Ethan. I just know who shouldn't suffer. David became quiet. Finally, he said something that stayed with me. Your father would be proud of that answer. I thanked him before hanging up. At 10:42 p.m., my phone vibrated. Margaret. Joint accounts are frozen. Thank you. Daniel attempted 3 transactions while we were processing. I closed my eyes. He already knows. Apparently. Another vibration. Richard. The emergency filings are complete. Then Linda. Resolution 12 has been entered into the corporate record. Everything had happened exactly as my father designed it. Legal. Transparent. Irreversible. At 10:49 p.m., I opened the shareholder portal on my phone. One final authorization remained. It represented my entire ownership position. $885 million in equity. Years of accumulated value. Generations of work. I wasn't destroying the company. I was removing my ownership under provisions every director had previously approved. My thumb hovered above the confirmation button. I didn't think about Daniel. I thought about my father. About Ethan. About every lesson I'd ignored because I believed love could overcome arrogance. Then, I pressed confirm. The screen displayed one word. Completed. I set the phone on the table. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then it began. Buzz. 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 Daniel. Ignored. Buzz. Melissa. Ignored. Buzz. Chief Operating Officer. Ignored. Buzz. Board Chairman. Ignored. The vibrations came so quickly the phone almost crawled across the tabletop. I picked it up only once. Not to answer. To look. 67 missed calls. The number almost seemed unreal. Voicemails poured in one after another. The first was Daniel. Claire, answer the phone. This isn't funny. The second. What the hell did you do? The third. The bank says our accounts are frozen. The fourth wasn't angry anymore. Please call me. By the 10th message, panic had replaced confidence. By the 15th, he was shouting at someone else. By the 20th, he sounded frightened. I switched the phone to silent. For years, everyone believed Daniel Harrison held the reins of Harrison Capital. Television interviews had reinforced that image. Magazine covers had celebrated his leadership. Industry conferences invited him to deliver keynote speeches. Meanwhile, I quietly chaired governance meetings, approved long-term strategy, reviewed risk assessments, and signed documents that rarely made headlines. I never corrected the public. Recognition had never interested me. Peace had, but peace requires mutual respect. Without it, silence becomes surrender. Around midnight, another call came. This time from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Claire, it was Daniel. He must have borrowed someone else's phone. You've made your point. My point? You froze everything. Yes. You've got to reverse this. I remained silent. Claire, listen to me. No, Daniel. You don't understand what's happening. I understand perfectly. The board's calling an emergency meeting. I expected that. The banks are asking questions. I expected that too. His breathing became uneven. You can't do this. I already did. You'll destroy everything we built. I finally spoke the words that had quietly waited inside me all evening. No, Daniel. A long pause settled between us. Then I said, I'm protecting what my father built. He didn't answer. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I ended the call. Back inside the room, Ethan stirred in his sleep. I walked over and rested my hand gently on his back. His tiny fingers wrapped around one of mine without waking. In that simple moment, every doubt disappeared. I hadn't left because I wanted revenge. I'd left because my son deserved to grow up watching a mother who knew the difference between forgiveness and permission. Outside, the harbor lights shimmered across the dark water. Inside, my phone finally became still. For the first time since walking out of that house, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of a different life, one built not on appearances, but on truth. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I didn't recognize the room. Then Ethan made a soft little sound from his crib, stretched his arms toward me, and smiled the same carefree smile he'd worn while everyone sang to him the day before. Children have a remarkable gift. They wake each morning believing the world is still good. I prayed he would keep that gift for a long time. I picked him up, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, "Happy birthday, day 2." He giggled. It was the first time I'd smiled since leaving home. Downstairs, the hotel dining room was nearly empty, except for a retired couple sharing coffee and the morning newspaper. The gentleman looked over as Ethan enthusiastically banged a plastic spoon against the high chair. "That's a healthy little fellow," he said with a grin. "He certainly keeps me moving." His wife smiled warmly. "Our grandchildren do the same thing." There was comfort in ordinary conversations. They reminded me the world hadn't ended. Only one chapter had. When we returned to the room, I finally turned my phone back on. The screen lit up so quickly it almost startled me. More than 200 notifications, voicemails, emails, texts, board alerts, financial updates, media inquiries. I ignored almost all of them. One message caught my attention. It was from David Moreno. "Call me when you can, it's serious." I dialed immediately. "You've probably seen the market alerts," he said. "I haven't looked." "Our lenders suspended negotiations on the Chicago acquisition." I expected something. "Not this." He sighed. "3 institutional investors are demanding an emergency briefing." "How are the employees?" "They're scared." That word settled heavily in my chest. Scared. Not angry. Not disloyal. Just frightened. David continued. "The rumor mill is moving faster than facts." "What are people saying?" "Everything. That the company is bankrupt." It isn't. "That you're divorcing Daniel." "That's true." "That federal investigators are involved." They aren't. "That the company will shut down by Friday." It won't. He paused. "What do you want me to tell people?" I looked out the window toward the harbor. "The truth." "Which is, payroll is protected. I've already secured that. No layoffs. I can promise that. No one loses their job because 2 executives failed their marriage." David became quiet. Finally he said, "I'll make sure everyone hears exactly that." After hanging up, I packed our bags. The hotel had served its purpose. I needed somewhere quieter. Somewhere that still felt like home. 3 hours later, Ethan and I pulled into the driveway of my parents' old lake house in western Connecticut. The house wasn't large. It wasn't glamorous. It had creaky wooden floors, faded blue shutters, and a porch swing my father built himself when I was 12. Every summer of my childhood lived inside those walls. Dad taught me to fish from the small dock. Mom planted roses that somehow continued blooming years after she was gone. The place smelled like cedar old books and memories. I unlocked the front door. "Welcome home," I whispered, for the first time in years. The words felt honest. Life slowed almost immediately. Instead of rushing into conference calls before breakfast, I made oatmeal while Ethan watched birds through the kitchen window. Instead of reviewing quarterly earnings, I pushed a stroller along the lakeshore. Instead of attending executive dinners, I sat on the porch listening to frogs sing as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The silence wasn't lonely. It was healing. By the 3rd day, the media had discovered I was gone. Television trucks appeared outside our former home. Financial commentators debated whether Harrison Capital would survive. Some called my actions ruthless. Others called them brilliant. Neither description felt accurate. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to stop pretending. Late that afternoon, someone knocked on the front door. I already knew who it was before looking through the window. Melissa. She stood on the porch wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. For a long moment, I considered not answering. Instead, I opened the door halfway. "What are you doing here?" "I just want to talk. There isn't much left to say." "Please." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me so Ethan couldn't hear. Melissa removed her sunglasses. She looked exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes. Her confidence had vanished. "I never wanted this." I almost laughed. "You never wanted what?" "To hurt you." "You managed anyway." Tears formed instantly. "It just happened." I looked at her quietly. "No, it did." "No, Melissa." She shook her head desperately. "We didn't plan it." "I know." Her expression changed. "You do. Affairs aren't usually planned." She stared at me. "They're chosen." She looked down. "It was a mistake." I reached into my handbag and removed a thin folder. "I thought you might say that." She frowned. "What is that?" I handed her several printed pages. Hotel receipts, private flight manifests, restaurant reservations, corporate credit card statements, phone records. Each page documented meetings stretching back nearly 2 years. She turned the pages slowly. Her face lost all color. "How?" "I oversee corporate compliance." She blinked. "I didn't investigate because I was suspicious." I met her eyes. "I investigated because company expenses suddenly stopped making sense." Neither of us spoke. The breeze rustled the maple trees above us. Finally, she whispered, "Daniel said you never paid attention." "I paid attention to everything." "So why didn't you say anything?" "Because I kept hoping there was another explanation." She covered her mouth. "I am so sorry." I believed she felt ashamed. I didn't believe she was sorry until she'd been caught. Those are different things. She handed the papers back with trembling hands. "What happens now?" "You go home." "And us?" "There hasn't been an us since you walked into my father's study. She started crying openly. I felt sadness, but not pity. She turned, walked to her car, and drove away without looking back. I never saw her again. That evening, David called once more. The board met today. How did it go? Poorly. Daniel. He spent most of the meeting insisting this was temporary. It isn't. They know that now. David hesitated. There was another problem. What? The banks requested updated governance documents. I already knew what that meant. They've realized who the controlling shareholder actually was. Yes. And there were some surprised faces. I couldn't help smiling faintly. For years, they congratulated the wrong person. You never seemed to mind. I honestly didn't. So what changed? I looked through the screen door. Ethan was sitting on the living room rug, carefully stacking wooden blocks my father had carved decades earlier. One block fell over. He laughed and started again. I stopped confusing humility with invisibility. David didn't respond immediately. Then he quietly said, "That's a lesson a lot of us learn too late." That night after Ethan fell asleep, I sat alone on the dock. The lake reflected thousands of stars. My father loved this view. Whenever business became overwhelming, he'd bring me here. He once told me, companies recover from bad quarters. Families don't always recover from broken trust. At the time, I thought he was talking about balance sheets. Now I understood he was talking about life. The phone rang again. Daniel. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded different. Not confident, not commanding, just tired. Claire. Yes, I've been looking everywhere for you. I know. I wasn't calling about the money. I waited. The board doesn't trust me anymore. I remained silent. They keep asking questions. They should. I never imagined, his voice cracked, that everything could unravel this fast. I closed my eyes. Neither had I. Not because of the company. Because of us. When I finally spoke, my voice stayed calm. Daniel, the company isn't falling apart because I left. He didn't answer. It's falling apart because trust did. The line remained silent for several seconds. Then he quietly whispered, I think I'm finally beginning to understand. I wasn't sure he truly did. But for the first time, he had stopped blaming everyone except himself. Sometimes that's where real change begins. The morning after my conversation with Daniel, the lake was perfectly still. Not a ripple. Not a breeze. The kind of quiet that almost asks you to listen more carefully. Ethan sat on a blanket in the backyard, chasing bubbles with determined little hands. Every time one burst before he could catch it, he'd laugh as though losing was simply another way to play. I watched him from the porch with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. Somewhere between his laughter and the sound of birds in the pine trees, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I was thinking about responsibility. There was a difference. One sought satisfaction. The other demanded wisdom. After breakfast, I decided to tackle a project I'd postponed for years. The attic. My parents had lived in the lake house for nearly 30 summers, and after they passed away, I never had the heart to sort through everything they'd left behind. Most of the boxes remained exactly where my father had stacked them. Dust covered nearly every surface. Old fishing poles leaned against one wall. Christmas decorations filled faded cardboard cartons. My mother's sewing machine sat beneath a white sheet. I smiled despite myself. She could turn an old pair of jeans into a quilt that lasted 20 years. Dad used to joke that she never threw away anything except bad ideas. Hours passed as I organized family photographs, school report cards, and dozens of handwritten recipe cards in my mother's elegant script. Then I found a small cedar chest tucked behind an old bookcase. It had my name written across the lid. Claire. Nothing else. My heart began beating faster. Inside were several neatly arranged envelopes. Each one carried a handwritten label. For your wedding. For the day you become a mother. For the day you doubt yourself. At the bottom rested one final envelope. My father's handwriting looked slightly less steady. For the day someone betrays your trust. I sat down on the attic floor before opening it. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. Dad had always preferred fountain pens, and the familiar blue ink instantly carried me back to childhood. The letter began simply, My dear Claire, if you're reading this, life has probably disappointed you in a way I hoped it never would. Already my eyes filled with tears, he continued. Money has a peculiar way of revealing character. It doesn't create selfishness. It exposes it. Success doesn't change people nearly as much as it removes the reasons they once hid who they were. I paused. Those words described Daniel more accurately than anything I'd heard on television or in board meetings. Further down the page, another sentence caught my attention. Never confuse revenge with justice. I read it twice. Then a third time. Dad continued. Justice protects innocent people while holding the guilty accountable. Revenge often forgets the difference. I lowered the letter and stared out the attic window toward the lake. For several minutes I couldn't move. My father's voice seemed almost present beside me. Patient, gentle, steady. I returned to the letter. If betrayal ever places great power in your hands, remember this: the receptionist didn't betray you. The accountant didn't betray you. The maintenance worker didn't betray you. The families who depend upon honest work deserve better than becoming casualties of someone else's pride. Those words landed heavily. I'd protected payroll. But was that enough? I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. By the time I carried the cedar chest downstairs, I already knew my next decision. I called David. Can you come to the lake house? I'll leave immediately. He arrived just after lunch carrying 2 thick binders. His face looked older than it had only a week earlier. I've never seen the board this divided, he admitted. They're frightened. They're also embarrassed. Because they backed Daniel. Because they suddenly realized how little they understood the company's ownership. We sat on the porch while Ethan napped inside. David opened the binders. The company's still fundamentally healthy. I expected that. Our clients haven't left. Good. But uncertainty is expensive. I nodded. What do you recommend? He looked surprised. You want my recommendation? I hired you because I respected your judgment. He smiled faintly. Then here it is. He leaned forward. Separate Daniel from executive authority. Go on. Stabilize governance. Go on. Keep the company operating normally. I waited. And don't become CEO. That answer surprised me. Why not? Because right now everyone expects this to become a personal war. I don't want one. I know. He closed the binder. So prove it. Those 3 words echoed my father's letter. Prove it. Not through speeches. Through decisions. That afternoon we drafted a proposal for the board. An interim executive committee would oversee operations. An experienced outside executive would eventually become CEO. I would remain majority owner but avoid day-to-day management. Daniel would be removed from executive authority pending the outcome of shareholder action. No public humiliation. No dramatic press conference. No revenge. Just governance. By evening, the board had scheduled an emergency vote. The following morning, Richard called. Daniel has requested a private meeting. I remained silent. You don't have to agree. Where? He suggested the lake house. I looked across the water. 1 hour. I'll arrange it. Daniel arrived exactly on time. The expensive tailored suits were gone. He wore khakis, an open-collar shirt, and the tired expression of a man who hadn't slept much all week. For a moment, we simply looked at one another. He seemed older. Not by years. By consequences. Thank you for seeing me. I gestured toward the porch chairs. He sat carefully. So, neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, he spoke. I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Did it help? No. I appreciated the honesty. He folded his hands together. I owe you an apology. I waited. I betrayed our marriage. Yes. I betrayed your friendship with Melissa. Yes. I disrespected your father's memory. My chest tightened. Yes. And... His voice nearly disappeared. I treated you as though none of this belonged to you. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable. Just truthful. He looked down at the porch floor. I kept telling myself I built Harrison Capital. You helped build it. I know that now. No. I shook my head gently. You knew it then. He closed his eyes. I suppose I did. There it was. No excuses. No blaming stress. No blaming success. Just ownership. After several moments, he asked quietly, Do you think you'll ever forgive me? It was the question everyone assumes has an immediate answer. It doesn't. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a journey. I don't know. He nodded. I understand. I believe you're sorry. His eyes met mine. But I don't yet know whether you're sorry because you lost your company. I paused. Or because you lost your family. The words seemed to strike him harder than anything else I'd said. His shoulders sagged. I've been asking myself that every night. And his eyes filled. For the first few days, he swallowed hard. I was mostly thinking about the company. He laughed bitterly. That's the ugliest truth I've ever admitted. I respected him for saying it. But yesterday, he looked toward the lake where Ethan's stroller rested beneath a maple tree. I realized I couldn't remember the last bedtime story I read to my son. His voice cracked. I missed an entire year while convincing myself I was working for him. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence allows truth to settle more deeply than words. Finally, he stood. I'm not asking you to come home. I looked up. I don't deserve that. He hesitated. But I'd like the chance to become the father Ethan deserves. I believed him. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to hope. As he walked toward his car, he stopped beside the porch steps. Without turning around, he said quietly, Your father saw through me long before I saw through myself. I smiled sadly. Yes, he still trusted me. He trusted that people could choose to become better. Daniel nodded once, then drove away. That evening, after putting Ethan to bed, I reread my father's letter. One sentence stood out more than all the others. Real strength isn't measured by how completely you defeat someone. It's measured by how wisely you use the power to do so. For the first time since that birthday party, I slept through the entire night. Not because everything had been repaired, but because I finally knew the difference between winning and healing. When people hear a story like mine, they often expect the ending to be a courtroom victory, a tabloid headline, or a dramatic scene where someone loses everything. Real life rarely works that way, especially after you've lived long enough to understand that every public victory usually hides a private loss. By the time autumn settled across Connecticut, nearly 4 months had passed since Ethan's birthday. The maple trees surrounding the lake house had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Every morning, Ethan insisted on picking up fallen leaves that were almost as big as he was. He'd hold one above his head like a trophy before handing it to me with a proud smile. Children celebrate simple things. Adults spend too much time chasing complicated ones. The divorce moved forward quietly. That wasn't an accident. Richard had prepared every document with extraordinary care, and Daniel's attorney surprised everyone by cooperating instead of fighting. There were no ugly depositions, no arguments over furniture, no attempts to hide assets, no television cameras waiting outside the courthouse. When reporters called, neither of us gave interviews. Some people thought our silence meant weakness. I knew better. Silence can protect dignity when anger cannot. One afternoon, Richard placed the final settlement papers on the conference table. You've been more generous than the law requires. I know. He looked at me carefully. May I ask why? Because I don't want Ethan growing up believing his parents spent years trying to destroy each other. Richard nodded slowly. Your father would have approved. I hope so. The financial settlement reflected years of shared life together. Daniel would leave the marriage comfortable, though nowhere near as wealthy as before. Some friends questioned my decision. One even said, after what he did, I'd leave him with nothing. I understood the emotion behind those words, but I also understood something else. If I spent the rest of my life measuring justice by how much someone suffered, I'd never stop keeping score. And I was tired of counting. The shareholder meeting took place the following week. It lasted nearly 6 hours. Every director attended. So did outside counsel, auditors, and representatives from our largest institutional investors. I walked into the boardroom for the first time since leaving home. Conversations stopped immediately. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed curiosity. A few revealed embarrassment. The board chairman, Harold Benson, stood as I entered. I believe we owe you an apology. For what? We allowed public perception to replace proper governance. I smiled gently. My father used to say organizations drift when people stop asking simple questions. Harold sighed. We certainly stopped asking. The meeting remained respectful from beginning to end. Financial reports confirmed what David had predicted. The business itself remained strong. Clients had stayed. Employees had remained productive. The greatest threat had never been the balance sheet. It had been uncertainty. When the vote finally came, it was unanimous. Daniel resigned from every executive position. Not because anyone forced him, because he stood and addressed the room himself. I've spent months thinking about leadership, he began. I confused authority with entitlement. The room remained completely silent. I asked people to trust me after proving I couldn't be trusted in my own home. No one interrupted. I don't deserve to continue leading this company. He signed his resignation before sitting down again. There was no applause, no celebration, only quiet acceptance. Afterward, the board approved our transition plan exactly as David and I had proposed. A nationally respected executive with decades of experience agreed to become the new CEO. I remained majority owner and chair of long-term governance, but stayed away from daily operations. The employees deserved stable leadership, not a family drama. When the announcement reached the staff, the response surprised everyone. Relief, not excitement, just relief. People could finally return to doing the jobs they loved without wondering what tomorrow might bring. That mattered more to me than any headline. Melissa disappeared from our lives almost entirely. I later heard she had moved to Arizona to live near her older sister. She sent one handwritten letter. It contained no excuses, only an apology. I never answered it. Not out of anger. Some relationships simply end. Replying would not have changed the past, nor would silence erase it. I prayed she eventually found peace. From a distance, Daniel's path looked very different than anyone expected. Several prestigious firms quietly approached him with lucrative offers. He declined everyone. Instead, he accepted a position with a non-profit organization that helped struggling family-owned businesses recover after floods, fires, and economic hardship. When David told me, I blinked in surprise. He's earning less in a year than he used to make in a month. David smiled. I don't think that's what matters to him anymore. Perhaps it wasn't. One Saturday morning, Daniel arrived at the lake house to spend the day with Ethan. He carried no expensive gifts, no designer clothes, just a small red wagon he'd restored himself. The paint wasn't perfect. One wheel squeaked slightly. Ethan loved it immediately. For nearly 2 hours, Daniel pulled him around the yard while Ethan laughed so loudly that even the neighbors smiled from across the fence. I watched from the porch, not as a wife, just as a mother. When it was time to leave, Ethan wrapped both arms around Daniel's leg. Dada. One word. Simple. Powerful. Daniel knelt, kissed Ethan's forehead, and promised, I'll see you Wednesday. Then he looked at me. I will. He wasn't talking to Ethan anymore. He was making a promise to me, and unlike months earlier, he kept it. Wednesday came. He arrived exactly on time. The following Saturday, on time again. The next week, again. No excuses, no last-minute cancellations, no forgotten birthdays, no missed pediatric appointments, no disappearing into endless business meetings. Just consistency. Week after week, month after month. One evening after Daniel left, my neighbor Margaret stopped by with homemade apple pie. She had been married for 53 years before losing her husband. We sat together on the porch while Ethan slept upstairs. She listened quietly as I described the changes I'd seen. Finally, she asked, Do you trust him? I thought carefully before answering. Not the way I once did. She nodded. Will you ever? I honestly don't know. She smiled softly. You know what I've learned after all these years? What? Trust isn't rebuilt by promises. She pointed toward the driveway where Daniel's car had disappeared an hour earlier. It's rebuilt by showing up. Those words stayed with me, because that was exactly what I had been witnessing. Not speeches. Not grand romantic gestures. Not expensive gifts. Just showing up. Again, and again, and again. I wasn't ready to call it redemption. Redemption belongs to time, not emotion. But I could no longer deny what stood plainly before me. Character had begun replacing pride. Humility had replaced certainty. Responsibility had replaced image. One chilly evening as Ethan fell asleep curled against my shoulder after a long day at the pumpkin patch, I realized something unexpected. The anger that had once filled every corner of my heart had quietly become smaller. Not because Daniel deserved less accountability. He didn't. But because carrying anger had become heavier than setting it down. Forgiveness still felt distant, yet bitterness no longer felt necessary. And that I realized was its own kind of freedom. 2 years can change a person in ways that 2 minutes never could. 2 years earlier, I stood in my husband's bedroom holding back tears while he told me to accept a betrayal or leave. 2 years later, I stood in my kitchen watching my son blow out 3 candles on a birthday cake, while the people who truly loved him surrounded him. The difference wasn't money. It wasn't the company. It wasn't even the fact that I had walked away with my family's fortune intact. The difference was peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. Ethan's 3rd birthday was intentionally simple. No business executives, no magazine photographers, no carefully arranged decorations designed to impress people who weren't part of our lives. Just family, a few close friends, a backyard full of laughter, and a little boy who was more excited about chasing bubbles than opening expensive gifts. My mother would have loved that day. She always said children remember feelings longer than they remember things. They remember who held their hand, who listened, who showed up. That was the lesson I carried with me. Daniel arrived shortly before lunch. He brought Ethan a small wooden puzzle instead of a mountain of toys. "I made the frame myself," he explained. Ethan immediately sat on the floor and began putting the pieces together. It wasn't perfect. Neither was the puzzle. Neither were any of us. But I noticed something important. Daniel didn't look around to see who noticed his effort. He wasn't performing. He was simply being present. After lunch, while Ethan played with his cousins, Daniel and I sat quietly on the porch. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us had changed over time. In the beginning, it was filled with anger, then sadness, then uncertainty. Now it was something different. Respect. "I want to thank you," he finally said. I looked at him. "For what?" "For not destroying me." I frowned slightly. "I didn't save you from consequences, Daniel." "I know." He nodded. "You made sure I faced them." The lake moved gently in the distance. "I lost my position." "Yes." "I lost people's trust." "Yes." "I lost you." I looked down at my hands. "Yes." He took a slow breath. "But you never tried to take away my relationship with Ethan." I thought about that. I wanted him to have a father. Even after everything, especially after everything. He looked toward the yard where Ethan was laughing. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself," I answered carefully. "Maybe you shouldn't forget what happened." He looked surprised. "Why?" "Because remembering who you were at your worst can help you become someone better." He nodded slowly. "I spent years chasing success. You weren't wrong to want success." "No." He looked at the ground. "But I was wrong to believe success made me more important than everyone around me." That was the first time I heard him say it without needing anyone else to explain it. Not a defense. Not an excuse. A truth. Later that year, I created the Harrison Family Foundation. The purpose was simple: to help families understand something my father understood better than anyone. Money without wisdom can damage generations. The foundation provided financial education for young entrepreneurs, supported small family businesses recovering from hardship, and taught future leaders about ethical decision-making. At our first annual event, I stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people. Years earlier, I would have hated that. I never wanted attention. But that night felt different. I wasn't there to tell people how wealthy I was. I was there to tell people what wealth had taught me. During my speech, I shared a simple message. Resources can create opportunities, but character determines what we do with those opportunities. Afterward, an elderly man approached me. He introduced himself as a small business owner who had nearly lost his company after a family crisis. He shook my hand. "Your father would have been proud." I smiled. "Thank you." "How do you know?" He pointed toward the foundation logo. "Because this isn't about revenge." That sentence stayed with me. Because he was right. When I first left that house, I thought I was protecting myself. But eventually I learned something deeper. The greatest victory was not watching Daniel lose power. It was watching myself stop needing him to lose. Pain can make us believe the only way to heal is to make someone else hurt. But healing doesn't work that way. Justice matters. Boundaries matter. Accountability matters. But peace matters too. A year after the divorce was finalized, Daniel and I attended Ethan's school performance together. There were dozens of parents sitting in folding chairs inside the elementary school auditorium. Some were recording on their phones. Some were wiping away tears. Some were struggling to keep younger siblings quiet. Just ordinary families. Just real life. Ethan walked onto the stage wearing a paper crown he had made in class. When he saw us sitting together, he smiled. Not because he understood our history. He didn't. He only understood that both of his parents were there. And that was enough. On the drive home, I thought about the woman I had been on that birthday night. The woman carrying her sleeping baby out of a house she thought represented forever. I wished I could go back and tell her something. I would tell her that losing a dream doesn't mean losing your future. I would tell her that dignity is more valuable than comfort. I would tell her that some endings are actually doors opening. And I would tell her that the quiet decisions made in moments of heartbreak often become the strongest decisions of our lives. Today, Ethan is still young. He doesn't know about the betrayal. He doesn't know about the company crisis. He doesn't know about the phone with 67 missed calls. One day when he is old enough, I may tell him. Not to make him angry. Not to make him choose sides, but to teach him something important. People will disappoint you. Even people you love. What defines you is not whether you experience pain. Everyone does. What defines you is what you choose to do with that pain. You can let it harden your heart, or you can let it deepen your wisdom. I chose wisdom, and I hope my son chooses the same. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life when you had to choose strength over anger, I hope you take a moment to reflect on that journey. Share your thoughts with someone who might need this reminder, and if stories about resilience, family forgiveness, and second chances speak to you, consider subscribing so we can continue sharing these meaningful stories together. Because in the end, the greatest inheritance we leave our children is not the money in our accounts. It is the example we set when life gives us every reason to become bitter, and we choose to become better.